Welcome to all of the participants today. We've got a really big crowd today and an absolutely wonderful webinar scheduled. I'm Ruth McCambridge, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Nonprofit Quarterly, and we have three wonderful guests today. This is part 2 of a little mini webinar series on full costs in nonprofits, how to understand them, how to work with them. And so Claire Knowlton is from Nonprofit Finance Fund is rejoining us to host this session, and she's brought with her Nurit Smith, she's the Deputy Director at Grand Performances, and Joyce Ibarra, who's the Director of Learning at the Weingart Foundation, and both of those organizations are in Los Angeles. So good morning, guys.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
These, the panelists today are going to help us understand how a change in the way we think about our financial model can actually transform our practice and our organizations. And that's a pretty big statement to make, but we're here to help you understand how that happens in a very practical sense. Before we go any further, though, I do want to let you all know that the reason why we can bring these webinars to you free of charge is because we do have a sponsor. And our sponsor for today is AccuFund, which is a nonprofit financial management specialist for nonprofits. They help with reporting, intuitive dashboards, and other kinds of tools, helping you to make sound decisions and get better strategic execution of your mission. AccuFund also helps nonprofits to streamline their processes, improve efficiency, and lower costs. Their nonprofit financial solutions are on-premise or cloud-based and are tailored exactly for your needs. In terms of logistics for today, this webinar is an hour long, and we want to leave a lot of time for questions at the end of it. And so we're going to go for about 40 minutes of presentation, and then we're going to take questions from all of you. But you all should be able to see at the right-hand side of your screen a place to log in your questions, and you can just do that at any time. You don't have to wait for us to ask, do you have any questions? Just go ahead and log them in whenever you're ready. One thing I do want to say, because this is always the #1 question that we get, is slides be available? So I want to say, not only do we only have 3 slides today, but the whole presentation will be available. It's the shortest deck in history. Come to us by Claire Knowlton, which I think that's a very wise decision, Claire. Keep it simple. But you can log in your questions, whenever you get ready, and we'll kind of sift through them and answer the questions that we think haven't been answered already or seem to be rising most to the top of the list. And also, finally, we very much believe in sharing, and we've actually accumulated quite an audience for these nonprofit structure and analysis webinars. And so make sure that you share what you're hearing with all of your friends and colleagues so we can build that group of people that's learning from this series. We have a hashtag you can use, which is #NonprofitFullCosts when you're tweeting out, and make good use of it. So with that, I want to pass this over to Claire, who's going to give us a review of the concepts that we're going to be working with today.
Thanks so much, Ruth. And as Ruth mentioned, this is part 2 in a series. So if you would like a deeper dive on full costs than what we're going to talk through in about 5 minutes right now, there is another webinar from earlier in this year that's on Nonprofit Quarterly's website. It's free, and so there's an hour session that's really just about the definitions behind full cost. But to make sure we can all use the same vocabulary on this call, we thought it would be helpful to just review very quickly what we mean by full cost. The sector uses that word and many other words like true cost, real cost, fully loaded cost, a whole variety of vocab. And often what is meant by that is program plus overhead. But we believe that full cost contains much more than just that. So Nonprofit Finance Fund, from our work in the sector for over 35 years as lenders and financial consultants and advocates within the nonprofit sector, we have come to define full cost by this pie that you see on the screen here, containing 6 slices. Starting at noon and moving clockwise, the purple slice is our total expenses. That captures both our program and our overhead, all of the day-to-day costs of just running the organization. It also includes what we would call unfunded costs, those costs that you really should be incurring to do your work fairly, but you just don't have the cash to do it. So an example can be underpaid staff, a really common piece of unfunded expenses captured in that total expenses slice. And I think the total expenses slice is one that most folks feel pretty comfortable with. It's something that we look at in our annual budgets. It's something we think about pretty commonly. The rest of the slices of the pie become a little more foreign to some. So moving to the green slice, working capital. This is dollars that sits in the bank account so you can manage the ebbs and flows of cash coming in and out of your organization. It's not to carry you through deficits. You end the year with a break even or with a surplus, but this is cash that helps you manage the timing of the dollars coming in and coming out, and it's needed by all organizations. Reserves address a variety of needs, really around risk and opportunity, and how you define reserves is particular to your organization, but we do believe that every organization needs some sort of a risk or operating reserve, some dollars that are set aside for a rainy day or in case something goes wrong, in case a funder exits, in case you're hit with a lawsuit, in case there's some sort of unexpected expense that the organization needs to weather. Debt principal repayment may sound very obvious. If you take out a loan, you have to be prepared to pay it back. But paying back that principal is not something that shows up in our day-to-day expenses. It doesn't show up on our profit and loss statements. So we need to be very cognizant about setting aside those dollars to pay back that debt. Fixed asset additions, those are dollars to buy things like buildings, equipment, furniture, and fixtures. And finally, change capital is a special pot of money that is to really help an organization manage a significant change. So going through a period of growth or scaling or of downsizing, going through merger, moving into a new geography. We find that changes of that magnitude really require a great deal of flexible funding to help the organization adjust their business model to that new reality. So not just growing or changing their programs, but also growing and changing the way that the organization makes money, whether that be from foundation grants or from individual donors or from government contracts. So change capital, fixed asset additions, and debt principal repayment are things that are not needed by every organization or not needed by every organization all of the time. So once you've paid down debt, you don't need to set aside dollars to pay it down anymore, right? You've paid it off. And fixed asset additions, you probably don't buy a new building every year. And change capital, you're probably not going through a significant restructuring every year. I sure hope you're not going through a significant restructuring every year. So some of those costs are less frequent or are needed by some at some times, but not all at all times. We definitely see the needs, the full cost needs of an organization being very particular to each organization. So don't think of this pie as sort of representing 100% with each slice being equal. Rather think of these as seats at a table or voices in a conversation that are asking for you to pay attention and say, what makes sense for our organization? So based on sector, organizational size, organizational life cycle, the community that you're in, the full cost that you need will vary quite significantly from your colleagues in the sector, and they will change over time. They'll change from year to year. So Joyce and Nurit have joined this call because we have been running a really exciting pilot that we've called the Full Cost Community of Practice Pilot here in Los Angeles. It's been funded by the Weingart Foundation and the California Community Foundation, and we've engaged with 12 nonprofit organizations from a variety of sectors. So Nurit is coming to us from an arts organization, Graham Performances, but also in this cohort were housing agencies, health clinics, advocacy organizations, youth services organizations. So we really span the gamut in terms of organizational size, the smallest being somewhere around $500,000, the largest being $35 million, and sector and age. So there's a lot of learnings that have come out of this. In the pilot, we engaged in joint learning workshops where both the nonprofits and the funders attended together and learned as peers, and follow-on technical assistance for both around understanding and calculating full cost and engaging in communications around full cost. How do I as a nonprofit ask for my full cost needs? How do I as a funder think about engaging my grantees in conversation about full cost? So with that, with that intro, I'd love to turn it over to Nurit and hear from you about your experience. So if you could tell us about maybe a little bit about who Graham Performances is, so we have some context, and the work that Graham Performances did to understand their full cost. What kind of process did you undertake, and what sort of changes have you made as an organization?
Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Ruth and Nonprofit Quarterly for having us on. Thank you, Joyce and Weingart and the California Community Foundation for the vision in seeing this change within our sector. Grant Performances is a 30-year organization here in Southern California. Our mission is to inspire community, celebrate diversity, and unite Los Angeles through access to free global performing arts. Every summer we have local, national, international artists that come and do live performances, master classes, talkbacks with audiences, and it's all for free. The organization, I joined 2 years ago. We have staff, senior staff that have been here for 20+ years. I hired a new financial administrator. So over the past year and a half, we've actually been relooking at all of the systems, internal systems within the organization. So the Nonprofit Finance Fund and the Full Costs project fit perfectly into this, that we were already in these conversations. Having the coaches at NFF review, refine, and enhance our suite of financial statements was critical. Even if it was just, you guys are doing great, was a good sort of pat on the back of we've been working in the right direction with that. We had sessions with our coaches for both the board of directors, which took about an hour and a half, and really was this, I'm assuming was this first phase that Claire did with the Nonprofit Quarterly that you guys can check in on, which is just sort of the basics of nonprofit finance, which is so bizarre and awkward for everybody to understand the idiosyncrasies within that, because I'm sure as many of you have bankers and people who think they understand finances, but nonprofit finances is a completely different beast. And then the 3-hour session with our staff. Full costs is this iterative process that it's constantly changing. And in the 3-hour session with our coaches, dollars and numbers weren't included in those conversations. So it's really that those basic building blocks of understanding nonprofit finance and the full cost system is sort of where we are right now. Myself and our finance administrator have been sort of marinating in this a lot longer than our staff, which was only about a month and a half ago, our session. And we have started implementing little pieces, little baby steps, but helping to reframe how the entire organization looks at finances. We often get stuck in this admin, fundraising, program buckets that have been given to us, and then our entire organization morphs into these buckets. Well, what's happened is that our staff have siloed into these buckets as well, and that there really needs to be more of that understanding of the entire enterprise, how their portion fits into and connects to the entire mothership, right? So really talking it through with senior staff to break out of that. How that's reflected in our finances is we're changed our statements. This is in process, and we're going to launch our 2017 budgets. We're on calendar year, but including what are the major levers that trigger our organization. When somebody says, you know, what is a lever for you? My admin is not a lever for me, but my salaries are, and full-time versus part-time salaries, the professional fees. It's not fundraising, grant writer, contractor. It's professional fees as a whole. So relooking at what those buckets are for our organization and presenting that to our board. So it's also not broken into that piece. It's also claiming that space with courage about overhead. And not being scared to lay out those numbers the way that we are actually utilizing the dollars within the organization. I think one of the critical pieces with full costs and what the NFF has brought into this sector is just the language, identifying concepts and putting that framework around what we have been doing, but now can speak more clearly internally as well as externally about. For me, this idea of non-operating funds. What is funding that comes in that feeds the non-operating funds? That's sort of what I identify as sort of bad money versus good money that comes into our organization. What is the money that's feeding our operating funds, that is healthy for us, that satiates us and clears our thirst for money, versus the money that is more like salt water that leaves us thirsty afterwards, that puts more pressure on our resources and on our staff and all of that. So really helping our staff identify the bad money versus good money and non-operating funds versus operating funds. Also the subsidy businesses, identifying the subsidy businesses within our organization, fundraising, sweat equity, that if there is a project that is coming down the pipeline or that a senior staff member wants to shift some of our strategies and our how we are functioning, that our subsidy businesses have to shift as well. There is a direct correlation between our subsidy businesses and how we're functioning. And so really making sure that we are stepping away from that expanding, contracting cycle that a lot of nonprofits fall into. I think that's about all for now. I'll try and feed in some other thoughts about the process, but the team over at Nonprofit Finance Fund and our coaches were just invaluable to work with, both for the organization as well as just for me personally, and making me smarter in finances. So thank you.
Can I interrupt for a minute and just ask a couple of the questions which really do follow up directly from what you just were talking about, Nard? I loved that salt water analogy, because sometimes, you know, you drink enough of it, it makes you a little loco. And I think that all of us who work in nonprofits have experienced that. But we had a number of questions, and please feel free, Claire and Joyce, to chime in on this also. But they were curious. A couple of people were curious about the notion of a lever. Can you give us examples of what a lever might be in a particular kind of organization?
So as Claire mentioned, I come.
What how are you using the term?
So as Claire mentioned, I come from the art and culture sectors. We do big production through a specific time of the year. Levers for program is not a lever for me. That's just too big of a bucket, right? So we looked at what are the line items in our statement of activities that really are significant, that shift, that can trigger our organization to either be healthy or not healthy. Touring is a number that moves like this for us, whether we're bringing international or national artists in. Insurance was also a big piece for us because of all of the staff and employment that we do throughout the year. Like I said, salaries. We've been using a lot more consultants, so I wanted to make sure that those professional and consultant fees were in there. And so I can really see what those larger buckets are within our organization. Like I said, this was a process over hours that we had internally and with the coaches. This is how we think we want to bucket, and it may shift in a couple of years. We actually may be doing more of this outreach and community activities, and that bucket grows, and we want to have a clear eye into that on an ongoing basis.
And we'll often use the word lever to talk about what's under an organization's control. So stepping outside of the arts, I'll bring in an example from a client who does child abuse prevention. And so when we think of, and Nurit was talking about kind of like the expense lever side of things, so I'll talk about a revenue lever example here. So this organization is in a period of growth, needs to figure out how to generate more revenue, but sits within a hospital system, and so does not have their own fundraising department, and actually can't have their own fundraising department. So what are the levers available to that organization to change their business model? Well, the levers that are in their control are having conversations with the hospital fundraising department and actually paying the hospital fundraising department more to do more fundraising on their behalf. Another lever that's in their control is working with the hospital billing department to follow up on what seem like very small collectibles to a large hospital system, $1,000 or $2,000, but that are very meaningful amounts of money to this agency that sits within the hospital system. So we'll often use the word levers to think about, like, what are the financial things that end up being in our control.
Great. And someone had a related question just about how do you think, how are salaries a lever for you?
That's a good question. Well, salaries and benefits, and we've actually separated those to understand. As Claire said, this is stuff that's in our control. Do we have room to expand that? Also, our staff is our greatest resource. So how are we utilizing that resource to the best that we can, and to really see it within the entire framework and context of all of our expenses?
Let me just, in terms of just the term lever, it really is meant to indicate a place where you can, with a smaller amount of effort, create a larger change. So a lever is something that lifts more than you would usually be able to lift because of the way it's situated. And so looking for those places where a modicum of effort can produce a big outcome is really part of strategic thinking. And it's once you begin to think in that way, it becomes more and more naturally. But if you don't generally think in that way, it can be very, very hard to achieve. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Claire and Joyce. And I do have some more questions about what you were talking about, Nurit, but we'll do that later.
Thanks, Ruth. Thanks, Nurit. So Joyce, sitting on the funder side of the equation here, Weingart Foundation gives a lot of general operating support, and by its nature, general operating support can be used for any of the pieces of full cost. So in your experience moving through this pilot community of practice around full cost, what are the processes or practices that the foundation has changed as a result of this pilot?
Sure, thank you, Claire. Let me just start by sharing a little bit of background on the Weingart Foundation. So we're a Los Angeles-based grant maker. We fund about $30 million in grant making a year, and we fund in 6 Southern California counties from Santa Barbara down to San Bernardino and Riverside. The majority of our grant making is to organizations that do work in health, human services, and education, and our focus is on really building nonprofit capacity and effectiveness to serve our underserved communities in these counties. For several years now, I would say since the onset of the recession, we've been primarily a funder of general operating support grants, as Claire mentioned. About 70% of our grant-making budget is allocated to unrestricted grants. And we're a responsive grant maker in that we don't solicit requests. We have an open grant-making process, and so long as you fit our mission and our guidelines, we're open to having conversations with you about the work that you're doing. Over the course of providing these unrestricted grants, I would say prior to the recession, a lot of our grant making was very restricted. Program grants for very specific projects, capital grants to build buildings, restore buildings, whatever it might be. Most of the dollars went to that, and we made this shift really because we saw the need in the nonprofit community that really they were trying to stay afloat. So our initial learning around unrestricted grants was about helping organizations to basically maintain and sustain their work. But our conversations have certainly evolved over time, understanding that unrestricted grants really do provide critical resources to help sustain capacity as well as build capacity. And we thought we were doing a pretty good job at having conversations about nonprofit finance with our grantees. Because these are unrestricted grants, our conversations and our due diligence process really does go beyond just talking about the programs and services that our grantees are providing, but really takes to them as an organization, seeing them as a whole person, quote unquote. And so that does involve very direct and conversations about finances and what their sort of revenue needs are, as well as conversations about board leadership, fund development capacity, cultural competency, all of those sorts of things. And typically, the financial conversation was usually the most significant conversation in these due diligence. There's always a lot of questions. What was very humbling for us in participating in the pilot with Nonprofit Finance Fund and grantees such as Nurit was just knowing that these conversations are very hard and very difficult for our grantees to have with us, the funders, because there's that inherent power dynamic. And we as program staff always remind ourselves of that and try to ask open-ended questions so that we can get at the story. But I think even going through this, learning together with our grantees really reminded us that even if you have a good relationship with your grantee, there still might not be, you still might not get the full picture, and we still need to be very intentional and candid in our conversations, but also be aware that the dynamic exists and try to create an environment where they can have open and honest and trusting conversations with us without ramifications on the decision related to the grant application that you're talking about. So what that has meant from a process and practices point of view is really, what's great about the pilot as well is that we got this beautiful pie and all of these great definitions, and we begin to develop a shared terminology, which I think has been one of the biggest benefits of going through the training with NFF and the partners. And so it's about now using these terminologies in a way that are not fully loaded. And so when an organization is coming to us, often they think what they want to ask us for is for change capital, to develop a new program or expand services somewhere else, while skipping over some of the other pieces of the pie, like working capital and reserves. But we've begun to have much more honest conversations about, well, what are your cash flow needs, not just based on this 990 and audit that you provided to us, but on a month-to-month basis, so that we can fully understand what are the unfunded costs that your organization is, carrying, that are not allowing you to then achieve your mission to the fullest extent possible. It's really added a level of humility for our staff to begin to enter these conversations. And what we do also is just share with each other what those conversations look like, because you've met one foundation, similarly to nonprofits and grantees. They're all very different, and we don't want to reduce them to the overhead ratios and the liquidity formulas that that we do use as part of a tool, but is only one aspect of the financial review that we're looking at. So I'll stop there for now and see if there's any follow-up questions from Claire or others.
Yeah, so you talked about the experience being humbling, and I wonder if you could expand a little more on what about that joint learning experience was humbling.
Yeah, being a leader of a nonprofit is really tough work, and all of our staff, I think, truly recognize that. But I think, what was great about the pilot is we went through actual exercises where we were given a case study, looked at, mock financials, and were sort of tasked with calculating the full cost using this pie and some of the tools that NFF provided to us. And that was a case study that was almost, it had a lot of good things, but, from a program officer's perspective, we see, nonprofit financials that range in, from very, clear and, easy to understand to I have no idea what's going on here. And I think what was humbling was that, you know, it takes a lot to understand your financials. As you know as an individual, my own bank accounts and balance sheet, it's hard for me to keep on top of that. And understanding that nonprofits are managing, not just one paycheck, to reference Claire's article, but revenue sources from anywhere from 2 to 2 dozen, and that all have different requirements. And so from our perspective, it was really sort of giving the nonprofit executive directors the credit that they deserve for managing to do what they do at the ground level within community, working in such restrictive, often environments related to their funding. And I think what was great too was that we were in a room together with nonprofits where we weren't talking about a grant application. So hopefully, I want to say, and Claire and her team did a wonderful job in just opening up an environment where we could have open conversations about how difficult nonprofit finance is, how difficult fundraising is, how difficult it is to even understand, quote unquote, overhead and indirect versus program expenses, and that there's these other pieces that we finally put a name to, like the sweat equity, the unfunded costs of not having an administrative assistant, and how that impacts an executive director's ability to then fundraise. Oftentimes we look at fundraising capacity and look at, oh, you need a DD, a development director, but maybe you don't. Maybe you need an administrative assistant so that your executive director can do what they're really supposed to be doing. And so those are some examples, I think, of how we felt in the room and how much respect we had for our grantees that helped us to just remind us that it's tough work out there.
I think it's so interesting because when you were just talking about, the assumptions that we make about one thing versus another, this, what we've been used to over the years is a very simple pie chart that basically has 3 chunks. One is program, one is fundraising, and one is administration. And it's never made a whole lot of coherent sense from one organization to another, but we kept trying to fit things in a way that would make us look okay. So that it had very little sophistication, very little, and as a result of that, I think it created almost a simplistic mindset on the part of nonprofit managers about what they needed to do about what was in front of them. And what it appears to me is that this actually gives us a lot more room to talk about, well, what actually keeps this endeavor going? How much working capital do we need in a heavily grant-dependent organization? So to ask the very specific questions that, of course, we always asked in the background, but couldn't report out that way. We almost felt like we had to create a little bit of subterfuge all the time. So I'd be interested in knowing, Nori, if there are things that you feel like you've been able to surface as conversations that you've never been able to surface before.
One of the things that came out through this process with staff is that, and again, we know this, but everybody, and Joyce alluded to this earlier, everybody walks into the room with certain beliefs and attitudes around money and needs, from a very personal place. So that I think for us, it's about getting everybody onto the same kind of psychographics, the same value system around money, and to nurture this new way of looking at and including senior staff in budgeting. In the past, the ED has just handed down a budget and said, these are the buckets, this is your money. This is a completely different holistic approach to it. and that, you know, I'm not fully answering your question, Ruth, because I don't know if we've actually reached that point of you know, the session, the 3-hour session with the coaches was a very, it was like a retreat for us in really trying to identify what each department's needs are today, a year from now, and 10 years from now. Now we're starting budgeting for 2017. We're going to go back to that information and start putting some dollars around it as well. But I also saw that one department was saying one thing, another department another thing, and realized, oh, that's somewhat similar, and we could actually just get one person to help with that. Or if we identify what all those cross sections are within our organization, and that's also part of that siloed that we're trying to break out of as well. I hope that answered it.
Claire, can I ask you, and anybody can answer this, what's bad money? How could money possibly be bad? And maybe you can talk about the variety of bad money there is out there and what it does to good organizations when bad money happens to good organizations.
That's great. And I think bad money is very much Nurit's term, so I'm going to credit her with that one too, in addition to the salt water, right? She's coming up with all of these great images. So, you know, bad money is the money that does not advance the organization and actually costs the organization for a variety of reasons. So it could be money that is essentially off mission, money that we chase probably because we're running into cash flow challenges and we actually just need some more working capital in the bank, but money that we chase because it's something that we can get to very quickly, even though it doesn't align with what we as an organization should be doing or where our expertise lies. So we get that short-term money to kind of shore up our cash position, but then have to deliver on the expectations against that money. And so that distracts staff from the more important work that they need to be doing. It kind of creates this cyclical effect where you chase the money for a short-term cash flow problem, you then have to deliver against it, which takes you off mission and off focus. And so now you have another cash flow problem because you really should have been. So there's that kind of money. You know, there's also money that is highly aligned with what you're doing, is really paying for the programs that you want to be delivering, but the requirements of that money are such that they actually put more cost onto the organization than what they pay for. So, you know, we have to be careful with things like matching grants. We'll match, you know, sure, we want to do this program, we're going to do it anyway, great, here's half the money, and now you have to match it. But you have to match it from a particular source that you're not very good at getting money from. Like maybe you have to match it with individual gifts, and you don't have an individual giving program. So what does it cost the organization, and how are those costs being funded to build up the infrastructure to secure individual gifts against this matching grant? So, so bad money can be in the form of what we call unfunded mandates, requirements that you do a lot of stuff that the money doesn't pay you to do.
Mm-hmm. Joyce, I wanted to ask you, when you do understanding the relationship between grantors and grantees, when you have sat with a grantee and introduced this conversation to them, do you ever have a moment of feeling like you're watching a deer in the headlights? How do those conversations progress?
Yes, we have a lot of those deer in the headlight moments. And again, I think one of the things we take away from the pilot and working with this group here was that those conversations, you can have the deer in the headlight moments, but it's also a teachable moment. And but we're learning as well as funders in terms of just the full picture of all of these different stressors on an organization and how these different finances work. Typically what happens is, you know, I'll have the question, you know, how you know, do you understand your full costs or what it takes to run your organization? And then they'll give me, yeah, you know, and they'll give me the ratios according to the program, administrative, and fundraising as it is laid out in the audit and in the 990. And we'll dig a little bit deeper about, well, no, really, you know, I see, you know, we'll take a look at their financials, their audit, and how they ended each year. And oftentimes, you know, it's with not as desirable levels of cash on hand, probably not as much reserve. So we'll open the conversation about, you know, have you ever had a reserve? Are you open to having a reserve? What do you do for cash flow when you don't have, you know, dollars in your account, when you have days of cash on hand and you have payroll? And you know, there's some hesitancy, and being honest, I will say a lot of nonprofits enter that conversation very slowly and measuredly. But I think, you know, we are having a conversation about an unrestricted grant that could help to address some of those needs. And we're really coming at it from a learning perspective at understanding what are your true needs, because you can, in fact, use our dollars to pay your payroll. And you can, in fact, use our dollars to put in a bank account and not spend them and still have them there after 2 years if you want to. Because I think we are really trying to share and push an understanding that the balance sheet is a very important thing, including operating reserves, including dollars that just need to sit there for a rainy day. So I will say, again, these conversations have evolved over the several years that we've been providing unrestricted grants, and they're becoming more nuanced and they're becoming more holistic, including all of these different buckets. And our grantees are being more open to asking for their true needs, whether it be for an operating reserve or whether it be just to hold for working capital purposes. That's a little less so now, but I think that will increase again as we continue to have these conversations about full cost. What they are quick to say is that, yes, our dollars are the antidote to the saltwater, saltwater grants or saltwater dollars. And we know this. We know that government contracts often come with very limited, you know, allowance for indirect, or that some of our colleagues in philanthropy provide very restricted grants. And we tell them that we know this and that that's why we continue to hold the line and continue to provide truly, truly unrestricted grants that don't even come with a budget attached to it. Feel free to spend it as you see fit within your needs. And because we also enter these conversations, again, like I mentioned, from a very holistic perspective, wanting to understand how then, you know, is what capacity needs you're talking to me about translate into your ability to deliver your mission, and what are your short-term goals over the course of this next, you know, 2 years of our engagement together. That takes a little bit away of the fear of, oh, okay, we're not just talking about the dollars here, we're also talking about why we're having this conversation to begin with, and that's because our mission fits with your mission. I don't know if that answers the question.
Okay, before you say, Nuri, Joyce, I have a whole bunch of questions that essentially are, do you have any sisters? What foundations are they in, basically? People want to know, you know, how do we get this language, you know, more common? And there's a lot of upset in these comments here about, you know, I keep trying to use more reasonable language, but what I'm faced with is that three-part pie. What in the world do we do? And when's government going to get on board? That one, you know, is a difficult one. But I just want to say that there's clearly, from what you're saying, people are like, how do we get funders to focus on this and to move beyond where they've been? Nuri?
Well, you know, first, I think just to answer that question and what it seems a lot of what's been generating on the comments in the chat room is that it's these conversations. we're just at the beginning, and NFF and Weingart and California Community Foundation, and it's just constantly becoming ambassadors for this and keeping this top of mind. I think it's great. I was going to chime in because I had an aha moment during the pilot process that something Joyce said reminded me of it, which was that our budget can be a moral compass internally. So Joyce and the funders are looking at it very strategically on for managing to it and for understanding our the organization's needs. But for internally, it really helps us claim this is what we believe in, and this is what matters to us most. And that as leaders in these organizations, how do we utilize this tool to make our organizations as resilient as we can be? And to not disconnect some of that emotion and morality around it.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And Ruth, I wanted to follow up with kind of this entire dialogue. You know, there is a need for a knowledge campaign in this sector, and that's something that Nonprofit Finance Fund and others are looking at very closely. You know, how do we do that? And there may be some much larger work rolling out in the state of California around this and perhaps beyond. But there's, you know, there are the pieces that are under our control as nonprofit organizations, which is to first know the truth for ourselves. If we don't know what our full costs are, we're not going to be able to get any funders to fund them. And right now, I think, as you know, many have said, we're stuck in these like program and G&A and fundraising boxes that don't give us any good information and really hinder us, you know, prevent us from thinking about what's outside of those little boxes, because there's a bunch more we have to think about. So the first is, let's tell truth to ourselves. Let's know what our full costs are and claim those internally. From there, let's think about which funders may be interested in hearing these messages. And you know, there's always risk in going to a funder and asking for something that sort of, you know, falls outside of what they typically give. But you know, Nonprofit Finance Fund is a state of the sector survey where we ask nonprofits to tell us about funder dynamics. You know, what conversations can you have with funders? And Grantmakers for Effective Organizations did a similar survey of funders. What are you comfortable talking to your grantees about funding? And the gap between what nonprofits perceive funders are willing to talk about and perhaps fund, and what funders think they're willing to talk about and perhaps fund is really big. With nonprofits thinking, funders are not going to talk to me about anything except my programs, and funders saying, no, I want to hear what those needs are. So in the same way that we have, we at Nonprofit Finance Fund have coached, you know, funders to say these are long-term conversations. Start small, repeat, you know, say again and again, we care about these issues. Let's talk about them. We may be able to help. For nonprofits, I would say, you know, the same thing, right? Like, so when there is an opportunity, when there's an opening, raise a question with your funders about working capital, something that's really important to us and something important across the sector. Is this something you might be willing to pay for?
You know, I think that the idea of a knowledge campaign, I think, is very important. There's been, you know, this big push around, you know, for God's sake, get off of the overhead thing. It's, you know, this is not a one-size-fit-all endeavor. You know, this is it's just an unfair and you know, doesn't make very much sense as a single measure. But we haven't really talked about the rest of all of this in those kinds of campaigns. We haven't said, you know, there's more to do here to make these budgets make sense to people. And I think it's really a numeracy issue, right? That we're relatively illiterate about about finances and about how to talk in common terms about our finances. Not overall, within our own organizations, my experience is people are very good at managing to reality. And they do it well. It's just in the overall conversation with funders and others that it gets really murky, and that trips us up like crazy. So if you guys are planning a campaign, sign me up. And you know, because my feeling is that this stuff is, the more we talk about it, the more normal, the more it will become the new norm for all of us. And that can happen very quickly. So I want to thank all of you for being here. It's been a wonderful session, and also thank all of the participants. For the participants who want to know where is that first webinar that we were talking about, we'll send you a link to it, and also to Claire's article on the topic after this. And so watch out for that. And Noreen and Joyce, it was wonderful to meet you and spend the time with you. And as always, Claire, great to see you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.